Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video provides a historical and sociological overview of the cultural impact of divorce on men in the United States. This content is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes, and does not constitute legal, psychological, or financial professional advice. Viewers should conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals regarding their specific circumstances. In the next 60 seconds, a man in America will walk into a courtroom and watch as the life he spent 15 years building is legally dismantled in a matter of hours. He represents a statistic that has fundamentally reshaped the American landscape. Approximately 50% of marriages in the U.S. end in divorce, and in roughly 70% of those cases, the filing is initiated by the wife. But this is not just about the end of a legal contract. It is about a massive silent demographic shift that has created a new class of American citizen, the postmarital man. There is a quiet crisis unfolding in the suburbs, the cities, and the digital spaces of this country, one that is redefining what it means to be a father, a provider, and a member of a community. We are witnessing the birth of a new cultural identity, one forged in the fires of litigation, social isolation, and the total upheaval of traditional masculine roles. If you think you understand the divorced dad stereotype, you are looking at an outdated map. The reality is far more complex, far more systemic, and far more consequential for the future of the American family unit. Over the next hour, we are going to deconstruct the divorce economy, the psychological fallout of the empty house syndrome, and the shifting legal precedents that are currently being challenged across the nation. This deep dive is designed to solve one of the most pressing information gaps in our modern society. For the American man today, the risk of divorce is a statistical reality, yet the cultural roadmap for navigating the aftermath is largely non-existent. We are going to move beyond the surface-level tropes of starting over, and instead analyze the potential outcomes of this cultural shift. By examining historical trends, peer-reviewed sociological data, and extensive case studies, we will provide a comprehensive understanding of the current climate. You will learn the specific mechanics of how divorce impacts male social circles, the long-term career trajectories of men post-separation, and the evolution of the shared parenting movement that is currently sweeping through state legislatures from Florida to California. This is about more than just surviving a breakup. It is about understanding the structural forces at play, so you can navigate the modern world with total clarity. To understand where we are, we must first look at the massive shift in the American domestic hierarchy over the last 50 years. In the mid-20th century, the cultural impact of divorce on men was largely mitigated by a rigid social structure. A man's identity was often tethered to his role as the primary breadwinner, and while divorce was stigmatized, his professional and social standing frequently remained intact. Fast forward to the present day, and the script has flipped. Today, a man's identity is increasingly tied to his active participation in the domestic sphere. When that sphere is fractured, the identity crisis is profound. Case studies from the early 2020s suggest that men often experience a sharper decline in social support networks compared to women after a split. In many American social circles, the couple friends often default to the woman, leaving the man in a state of social displacement. We are seeing a trend where men are forced to rebuild their entire social ecosystem from scratch at the age of 40 or 50, a task for which many were never culturally prepared. Let's look at the data regarding the social scarcity model. Research indicates that married men often rely on their wives as their primary, and sometimes only, emotional outlet. This is a historical trend rooted in traditional masculine conditioning. When the marriage ends, the man doesn't just lose a partner, he loses his entire communication infrastructure. This leads to a phenomenon sociologists call the silent withdrawal. Unlike the popularized image of the divorced man hitting the town, the reality for many in the U.S. is a retreat into isolation. This isolation has tangible impacts on health and productivity. Case studies have shown that post-divorce, men are statistically more likely to experience a decline in physical health metrics, often because the gatekeeper of health, traditionally the role held by the wife in many American households, is no longer there to encourage medical checkups or healthy lifestyle choices. Furthermore, we have to talk about the economic realignment. In the United States, the financial impact of divorce on men is often framed solely through the lens of alimony and child support. While those are critical factors, the deeper cultural impact is the loss of future value. For many men, the motivation for high-level career advancement was rooted in the provider paradigm. When a man is no longer living under the same roof as the children he is providing for, his relationship with his own labor changes. We are seeing a growing number of men opting out of the rat race post-divorce, choosing instead to downsize their lives and prioritize time over income. This is a massive shift from the 1980s and 90s, where the divorced man was expected to work even harder to maintain two households. This quiet quitting of the traditional provider role is a direct response to the perceived lack of ROI, return on investment, in a system that many men feel is structurally biased against them. Consider the case of shared parenting laws. 10 years ago, the default in most U.S. states was primary maternal custody. However, a cultural wave driven by male-led advocacy groups has seen a massive shift toward rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. This is a fundamental change in how American society views the father's role. It is no longer enough to be the weekend dad who takes the kids to the zoo once a month. The modern divorced man is increasingly fighting for and winning 50-50 custody. This creates a new cultural archetype, the single-father household. This requires a complete retooling of a man's lifestyle, from his housing choices to his work-from-home flexibility. We are seeing a surge in dad-centric local communities and digital forums where men exchange advice not on dating, but on meal prepping, school district navigation, and emotional regulation for children of trauma. This shift also impacts the real estate market. In major U.S. hubs, we are seeing the rise of secondary family homes, smaller, 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom apartments or townhomes designed specifically for divorced fathers who need space for their children half the time, but don't need the massive suburban footprint of the former family home. This is a direct architectural manifestation of the cultural impact of divorce. The market is adapting because the demographic is too large to ignore. But we must also address the digital renaissance of the divorced male community. In the absence of traditional community centers like lodges or local clubs, American men have turned to the internet to make sense of their new reality. This has led to the rise of various online subcultures, some of which are constructive, while others are rooted in grievance. The manosphere, as it's colloquially known, is a direct byproduct of the cultural upheaval of divorce. Thousands of men are seeking answers to questions like, why did this happen? How do I protect my assets in the future? What is my value if I am not a husband? By studying these trends, we see a population that is hyper-aware of the legal and social risks of marriage, leading to a marriage strike among certain demographics. This isn't just a fringe movement. It's a measurable trend in the declining marriage rates across the United States, particularly among men who have already been through the divorce system once. They are choosing LAT relationships, living apart together, as a way to maintain companionship without the legal and financial exposure of a traditional marriage contract. As we move forward in this series, we will break down the specific legal mechanics, the psychological rebuilding process, and the ways in which the American man is redefining his legacy in a post-marriage world. This is not about cynicism. It's about a new kind of realism that is defining the 21st century American male experience. We are moving away from the failure narrative and toward a restructuring narrative. The impact is deep, it is wide, and it is changing the very fabric of our society. To truly grasp the restructuring of the American male identity, we have to look at the collapse of the household executive bridge. Imagine a man named Mark, living in Columbus, Ohio in 2026. Mark is 42, a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, and has been married for 14 years. In his marriage, Mark operated under a traditional, albeit modern, division of labor. His wife managed the social calendar, the household logistics, the medical appointments for their 2 children, and the maintenance of their extended family relationships. When the divorce papers were served, Mark did not just lose a partner. He lost his primary interface with the world. This is what sociologists call the social capital deficit. In the immediate aftermath, Mark finds that his invitations to Sunday barbecues vanish. His connection to his children's school community feels filtered and awkward. He realizes he does not actually know the names of his neighbors, because those relationships were cultivated through his wife's social labor. This is a widespread historical trend in the United States. Men often outsource their social lives to their spouses, and upon divorce, they find themselves in a vacuum of isolation. Statistics from the mid-2020s indicate that divorced men are significantly more likely to report having 0 close friends compared to married men, or even divorced women. This isolation is not just a personal tragedy. It is a systemic cultural shift. When a large percentage of the male population loses its social anchoring, the result is a surge in loneliness-related health issues and a decline in community engagement. We see this in the rising numbers of men moving into anonymous apartment complexes where the sense of neighborhood is non-existent. Mark represents a growing demographic of men who are essentially starting their social lives from a baseline of zero at an age where most people are settling into deep-rooted networks. Now, let us examine the economic shadow effect. Case studies from recent years show a fascinating and often overlooked trend in how divorced men handle their finances and career trajectories. While the immediate focus is often on the division of assets, the 401k, the equity in the family home, and the savings accounts, the long-term impact is found in the change in risk tolerance. Imagine Mark again. Before the divorce, he was eyeing a promotion that required more travel and higher stress, but offered a 20% salary increase. Post-divorce, his motivation shifts. He is now paying a significant portion of his after-tax income in support, and he only sees his children every other week. The potential outcome is that Mark decides the extra work is not worth the marginal gain that will largely be diverted to legal obligations or a secondary household he does not live in. He chooses to stay in his current role, prioritizing his mental health and his limited time with his children over career climbing. This collective shift in male ambition is a silent drag on the national economy. When a significant portion of the workforce moves from a growth mindset to a maintenance mindset, the cultural impact on American productivity is profound. Beyond the office, the physical restructuring of the American home is changing the landscape of our cities. In 2026, real estate developers are increasingly marketing to the solo professional male. These are not bachelor pads in the 1970s sense. They are functional, high-efficiency spaces designed for the man who is a part-time father. We are seeing the rise of the flex room phenomenon. A man like Mark needs a home office during the week, but that same room needs to transform into a child's bedroom on the weekends. This has led to a boom in multifunctional furniture and modular interior design. The cultural impact here is the normalization of the transient household. The American dream of the white picket fence is being replaced, for many men, by the high-rise rental with proximity to the transit lines that take them to their children's school district. This migration from the suburbs back to the urban core or to specialized satellite communities is reshaping tax bases and school funding models across the country. There is also the matter of the legal landscape of 2026. We are currently witnessing a massive legislative shift regarding Title 4D of the Social Security Act. For decades, the financial incentives for states to collect child support created a system that many advocates argued was adversarial by design. However, recent historical trends show a move toward the professionalization of co-parenting. In states like Kentucky and Arizona, the legal starting point is now 50-50 custody, barring extreme circumstances. This change is not just a legal victory for fathers, it is a cultural earthquake. It mandates that men remain fully integrated into the domestic sphere. Mark, who might have been a secondary parent a generation ago, is now expected to be a primary parent half the time. This means he is navigating the grocery aisles, managing the laundry, and attending parent-teacher conferences with the same frequency as his ex-wife. This is the birth of the primary solo father archetype. It is a role that requires a level of emotional intelligence and domestic skill that many men were never taught. The cultural impact is a massive informal re-education of the American male. Consider the ripple effect on the healthcare industry. Post-divorce men in the U.S. are increasingly seeking out therapeutic interventions, but not in the traditional sense. We are seeing a rise in high-performance coaching and male-centric wellness retreats. These programs focus on the potential outcomes of a restructured life, teaching men how to manage the stress of litigation, how to rebuild their physical health after years of neglect, and how to develop a new sense of purpose outside of the traditional family structure. This is a move away from the broken narrative toward a peak performance narrative. Men are being told that divorce is not the end of their story, but the beginning of a second act that requires a new set of tools. Case studies from these retreats show that when men are given a framework for their new reality, their rates of depression and anxiety drop significantly. They begin to see themselves as the architects of their own lives rather than victims of a legal system. However, we cannot ignore the ghosting of the institution. A significant historical trend in 2026 is the declining rate of remarriage among men over 40. After experiencing the financial and emotional upheaval of a first divorce, many American men are concluding that the legal contract of marriage carries an unacceptable level of risk. This has led to the rise of the commitment without contract model. Men like Mark are entering long-term, stable relationships, but they are strictly avoiding the courthouse. They are protecting their remaining assets through complex trusts and cohabitation agreements. This shift is challenging the traditional American view of family values and is forcing a conversation about what a family actually looks like in the 21st century. If a man is a dedicated partner and a present father, does the lack of a marriage certificate change his cultural standing? The answer in 2026 is increasingly no. As we look at the broader picture, we see a demographic that is more cautious, more domestic, and more focused on personal sovereignty than ever before. This is the new male realism. It is a culture built on the lessons learned in the family court system, and it is a culture that is beginning to exert its influence on everything from political polling to consumer behavior. The divorced man is no longer a peripheral figure in the American story. He is a central protagonist in a rapidly evolving social drama. But even as men settle into these new roles, a new question emerges. As these men prioritize their time and their autonomy, what happens to the communities they used to build? What happens to the civic organizations, the local churches, and the neighborhood associations that relied on the traditional family unit as their primary building block? The answer lies in the way men are now choosing to congregate. We are seeing the emergence of new, intent-based communities that bypass the traditional geographic and familial boundaries. These are the networks that will define the next decade of American life. But to understand how these networks function, we first have to look at the most controversial aspect of the modern divorce experience: the weaponization of social media and the digital footprint. In a world where every disagreement can be recorded and every past mistake can be unearthed, how does a man truly start over? We are about to look into the digital battleground of modern separation and the new rules of reputation management that every man in America needs to understand before it is too late. In 2026, the digital battleground is the first place a divorce is won or lost in the eyes of the public. Gone are the days when a separation was a private matter discussed in hushed tones over backyard fences. Today, the cultural impact of divorce on men is inextricably linked to their digital footprint. Imagine a man named David in Austin, Texas. David is a successful software architect who has spent a decade building a reputation for reliability and leadership. When his marriage begins to dissolve, the conflict doesn't stay behind closed doors. It spills onto professional networking sites, neighborhood forums, and shared social media accounts. This is the era of the digital narrative war. In the United States, historical trends show that the party who controls the initial digital narrative often sets the tone for social support and even professional consequences. Case studies from the last 3 years highlight a terrifying potential outcome for men who are not digitally savvy: the preemptive reputational strike. In many cases, one spouse may use social media to subtly, or overtly, frame the other as unstable, absent, or financially irresponsible long before a legal filing even occurs. For David, this might look like a series of vague posts about the challenges of being a solo parent or the stress of managing a household alone. To the outside observer, these appear as cries for help or expressions of strength, but in the context of a pending divorce, they serve as digital breadcrumbs that build a case against the husband in the court of public opinion. By the time David realizes what is happening, his professional colleagues and local community have already subconsciously cast him in the role of the antagonist. This leads us to the new rules of digital reputation management. Step 1 in this modern deep dive is the audit of shared access. In 2026, a man's security is only as strong as his weakest password, and in most American marriages, passwords for banking, home security, and cloud storage are shared. The cultural impact here is a newfound sense of digital paranoia. We are seeing men proactively moving toward encrypted communication and two-factor authentication as a standard domestic practice. The step-by-step reality for someone like David involves the meticulous decoupling of digital lives, a process that is often as complex as the physical move. This includes revoking access to smart home devices like thermostats and cameras, which in several high-profile case studies have been used as tools for digital harassment or surveillance during the separation phase. Furthermore, we must analyze the rise of the digital evidence locker. In the American legal system of 2026, screenshots are as valuable as sworn testimony. Men are increasingly being advised to maintain a chronological record of all digital interactions. This isn't just about protecting oneself from false accusations. It is about establishing a verifiable historical trend of involvement and care. If David wants to prove he is a primary caregiver, he needs a digital trail of school emails, doctor appointment confirmations, and grocery delivery receipts. The cultural shift here is a move toward a hyper-documented life. The spontaneous, unrecorded moments of fatherhood are being replaced by a curated archive of proof. This creates a psychological burden where every text message and every email is written with the knowledge that a judge or a social worker might eventually read it. The impact on professional life is equally profound. In the U.S. corporate world, a man's personal brand is often his greatest asset. Historical trends suggest that high-net-worth men or those in leadership positions are particularly vulnerable to digital reputational damage during a divorce. A single disparaging post on a professional forum can trigger an internal HR investigation or lead to the loss of a key client contract. This has birthed a new industry in 2026, the personal crisis management firm for divorcing professionals. These firms work to bury negative search results and promote positive, neutral content to stabilize the man's online presence. The data shows that men who engage in proactive reputation management are far more likely to maintain their career trajectory and income levels post-divorce than those who leave their digital narrative to chance. Now, imagine the scenario of the shadow profile. Even if David deletes his social media, his presence remains through the posts of others. In 2026, the American public has a voracious appetite for domestic drama, fueled by algorithm-driven feeds that prioritize high-conflict personal stories. This has led to the TikTokification of divorce, where private disputes are turned into viral content series. For the American man, this means his most vulnerable moments can become public entertainment. The cultural impact is a significant increase in social anxiety among divorced men, who feel they are being watched and judged by an invisible audience. This digital scrutiny often leads to a withdrawal from online communities altogether, further deepening the social isolation we discussed earlier. Yet, there is a counter-trend emerging: the rise of protected male spaces. As a reaction to the volatility of public platforms, men are migrating to private, gated digital communities where they can discuss the mechanics of divorce without fear of surveillance. These are not the public forums of a decade ago. They are highly moderated, often subscription-based platforms that offer a mix of legal education, psychological support, and peer-to-peer networking. Case studies from these groups show a high success rate in helping men navigate the transition because they provide a safe space for the unfiltered male experience. Here, men like David can learn the historical trends of their specific local courts, find recommendations for forensic accountants, and talk openly about the grief of losing their family unit. This digital migration is also changing the way men date and form new relationships post-divorce. In 2026, the first thing a potential partner does is run a comprehensive digital background check. For the divorced man, his digital history is his resume. If that history is littered with conflict, it becomes a barrier to moving forward. This has created a culture of extreme digital caution. Men are becoming hyper-aware of what they like, what they comment on, and who they are seen with online. The potential outcome is a more guarded, more strategic male presence in the digital world. The era of the oversharer is ending, replaced by the era of the controlled broadcast. As we examine these step-by-step shifts in behavior, we see a broader cultural transformation. The American man is becoming a strategist in his own life. He is learning that in a high-conflict society, his privacy is his power. But this focus on defense and reputation management raises a significant question about the emotional toll of such a lifestyle. If every interaction is documented and every digital move is calculated, where does the room for genuine healing exist? The constant state of digital alertness can lead to a form of chronic stress that affects every aspect of a man's health and well-being. This brings us to one of the most critical, yet least discussed, aspects of the cultural impact of divorce: the physical and biological response to the legal siege. While we have focused on the digital and social, the internal reality for the American man is a storm of physiological changes that can have long-term consequences. In the next part, we are going to dive into the biological cost of conflict. We will look at how the prolonged stress of the divorce process affects everything from cognitive function to cardiovascular health. We will examine why the second act for many men is often hindered by health issues they didn't see coming, and the specific data-backed strategies being used in 2026 to mitigate the biological fallout of a broken home. You need to understand how the system doesn't just impact your wallet and your reputation, but your very heart and mind. The biological cost of the legal siege is a physiological phenomenon that most men in the United States fail to account for until the symptoms become impossible to ignore. To understand this, let us look at James, a 45-year-old architect living in Charlotte, North Carolina, in 2026. James is 6 months into a highly contested divorce involving significant assets and a complex custody battle. On the surface, James is holding it together. He attends his depositions, he meets his project deadlines, and he shows up for his supervised visitation hours. However, beneath the skin, James is experiencing what medical researchers call allostatic load. This is the cumulative wear and tear on the body and brain that results from chronic overactivation of the stress response system. In the American male demographic, historical trends show that the divorce process acts as a catalyst for a specific cocktail of biological degradation. When James receives a notification on his phone from his attorney or a confrontational text from his ex-wife, his body enters a state of fight or flight. His adrenal glands flood his bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. In a short-term survival scenario, this is life-saving. But in a 3-year legal battle, this constant hormonal flooding leads to a potential outcome of systemic inflammation. By 2026, data-backed studies have increasingly linked the prolonged stress of American divorce to a spike in cardiovascular events among men in their 40s and 50s. James finds that his resting heart rate has climbed by 15 beats per minute, and his blood pressure, which was always managed, is now hitting stage 2 hypertension territory. This is not just because of a poor diet, it is because his sympathetic nervous system is stuck in the on position. The cultural impact here is a silent health crisis among the divorced male population. We see a step-by-step decline in what is known as sleep architecture. James might be in bed for 8 hours, but because of the high cortisol levels, he never enters the deep REM cycles necessary for cognitive repair. This leads to the brain fog characteristic of many men going through the American family court system. James finds himself rereading the same paragraph of a blueprint 5 times. He forgets appointments. He loses his keys. In the high-stakes world of 2026 professional life, this cognitive decline is a liability. It creates a feedback loop. The stress of the divorce impairs his work performance, which creates financial anxiety, which in turn spikes his stress levels further. Case studies from male wellness clinics in 2026 show that men in this state often mistake these biological symptoms for a lack of willpower, when in reality, their biology is simply redlining. We must also address the impact on the male endocrine system. There is a documented historical trend involving the suppression of testosterone during high-conflict social isolation. In the United States, the loss of a social hierarchy and the disruption of a stable home environment can lead to a significant drop in T levels. For James, this manifests as a loss of muscle mass, increased abdominal fat, and a pervasive sense of lethargy. This biological shift changes how James interacts with the world. He becomes less assertive, more prone to conflict avoidance, and more susceptible to bouts of unexplained irritability. This is the biological feedback loop of divorce. The system isn't just taking his house. It is effectively altering his chemistry, making it harder for him to fight for his rights or his children. Now, consider the American nutritional landscape of 2026. For a man like James, who was used to a shared domestic routine, the sudden shift to solo living often leads to nutritional orphanhood. Historical trends indicate that divorced men frequently default to ultra-processed convenience foods or skip meals entirely during the high-stress phases of litigation. This isn't just about weight gain. It's about the depletion of micronutrients like magnesium and B vitamins that are essential for nervous system regulation. By the time James realizes he is in a health hole, he is often facing a long road of biological reconstruction. In 2026, the market has responded with specialized subscription services focusing on divorce recovery nutrition, but many men are too overwhelmed to even sign up. The psychological impact of this biological state is a phenomenon known as displacement aggression. When James's body is under constant internal siege, he is more likely to perceive neutral interactions as hostile. This can negatively impact his performance in court and his relationship with his children. If James loses his temper during a custody exchange because his nervous system is frayed, that moment is documented and used against him. This is why, in 2026, savvy legal and psychological advisors are emphasizing the physiological defense. Men are being taught that maintaining their health isn't a luxury. It is a tactical necessity. This involves a step-by-step protocol, strictly managed sleep hygiene, high-intensity interval training to burn off excess cortisol, and the use of wearable technology to monitor biometrics in real time. Imagine if James used a wearable device that alerted him when his heart rate variability dropped too low, a key indicator of a strained nervous system. In 2026, some men are actually using this data to decide when to engage in difficult negotiations and when to step back. This is the professionalization of the self. The American man is learning to treat his body like a high-performance machine that requires specific maintenance to survive the legal grinder. The potential outcome for those who ignore this biological reality is a post-divorce collapse, where the man wins his case but loses his health in the process, rendering the victory hollow. Furthermore, we are seeing a shift in the American healthcare system toward trauma-informed care for men. Historically, men have been less likely to seek help for the emotional fallout of divorce. However, the 2026 data shows a surge in men visiting specialized clinics for what is being termed acute transition stress. These clinics don't just offer talk therapy. They offer biofeedback, cold plunges, and neurohormonal balancing. This is a recognition that the cultural impact of divorce on men is as much a physical injury as it is a social one. James is part of a generation that is beginning to understand that the tough-it-out mentality is biologically unsustainable in the face of modern, multi-year litigation. But even as James begins to stabilize his biology, he faces another massive structural challenge: the identity vacuum. When the roles of husband and full-time, live-in father are stripped away, what is left? In the United States, a man's identity is often a house of cards built on these external roles. When the house falls, the psychological void is immense. We are seeing a historical trend where men, after stabilizing their health, enter a period of existential recalibration. This isn't just a midlife crisis. It is a fundamental questioning of the American social contract. This leads to the most significant cultural shift of all. As men like James rebuild their bodies and minds, they are not necessarily looking to return to the old way of living. They are looking for a new code of conduct. They are looking for ways to be men that do not rely on the fragile structures of the traditional nuclear family. This movement is redefining masculinity in the U.S. from the ground up. It is a move towards sovereign fatherhood and intentional brotherhood. In the next part, we are going to look into the rebuilding of the masculine tribe. We will examine how divorced men are creating new, non-traditional support systems that are replacing the lost social networks of their marriages. We will look at the rise of fraternal housing, the growth of male-only mentorship circles, and how the concept of the second family is being completely redefined in 2026. This is where the reconstruction truly begins. You have seen how the system breaks the man. Now you need to see how the man builds a new system that the world hasn't seen before. The reconstruction of the American man post-divorce in 2026 begins with the death of the lone wolf myth and the birth of the intentional tribe. Historically, American culture has celebrated the rugged individualist, but for the divorced man, this archetype has proven to be a biological and social dead end. To understand the shift, consider Robert, a 50-year-old former civil engineer in Denver. After his divorce in 2024, Robert found himself in a 5-bedroom house that felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. He was the classic victim of social pruning, where his married friends slowly stopped calling because his presence was a reminder of the fragility of their own unions. In 2026, Robert represents a major historical trend: the migration toward fraternal housing and collective living. Robert didn't just sell his house and move into a bachelor apartment. Instead, he joined a curated co-living space designed specifically for divorced professional men. These are not dormitories. They are high-end, strategically organized environments where men share resources, childcare responsibilities during their custody weeks, and, most importantly, a social safety net. In these spaces, the step-by-step rebuilding of a social circle happens organically. If Robert has a late night at the office, a fellow resident who is also a father can help oversee his children's homework. This is the birth of the tactical tribe. It is a direct response to the social isolation that has historically plagued divorced men in the U.S. Case studies from these co-living communities show a marked increase in psychological resilience and a significant decrease in the reported feelings of purposelessness that often follow a marital split. This movement is also reshaping the concept of the second family. In the past, a second family meant remarriage and stepchildren. In 2026, the second family is often a chosen group of peers. We are seeing a surge in what sociologists call platonic paternity partnerships. Imagine if Robert and 2 other divorced fathers decided to rent a large property together. They aren't just roommates. They are a functioning domestic unit. They coordinate grocery runs, they share a communal kitchen, and they create a stable, multi-adult environment for their children. For the kids, this provides a broader support system and helps mitigate the instability of the two-home lifestyle. This cultural impact is massive, as it challenges the nuclear family as the only viable model for a healthy childhood in America. Beyond housing, the deep dive into the 2026 masculine landscape reveals the rise of the high accountability mentorship circle. These are not traditional support groups where men sit in a circle and vent about their ex-wives. Instead, these are objective-driven organizations. A man joins a circle not just to heal, but to rebuild his life according to a specific curriculum. Step 1 is often a financial triage, where men work with peer mentors to restructure their debt and assets following a settlement. Step 2 is physical optimization, focusing on the biological recovery we discussed previously. Step 3 is legacy construction, where the man defines his goals as a father and a member of society outside of his former marriage. These circles use historical trends of male bonding, centered around shared tasks and challenges, to create deep, lasting loyalty. For Robert, his circle became his board of directors. When he considered making a risky career move or entering a new relationship, he had a group of objective men who knew his history and held him to his own standards. The data-backed results of these tribes are becoming impossible for the American healthcare and legal systems to ignore. Historically, divorced men have been a high-risk group for self-harm and substance abuse. However, men enrolled in high accountability tribes in 2026 show a 60% lower rate of these potential outcomes compared to those who attempt to navigate the aftermath alone. This is because the tribe provides what the marriage once did: a sense of being needed and a framework for daily behavior. The cultural impact is a shift from the man being a passive observer of his life to an active architect. This leads to a fascinating development in the American labor market: the rise of the divorced male entrepreneurial surge. When the traditional family structure dissolves, the man's relationship with risk often changes. For Robert, the divorce was a catalyst to leave his stable engineering job and start a consultancy firm. Without the pressure to maintain a specific suburban lifestyle for a spouse, many men find they have a higher tolerance for the uncertainty of a startup. They downsize their personal lives and funnel their energy into professional ventures. In 2026, we are seeing a spike in new business filings from men in the 40 to 55 age bracket. This isn't a get-rich-quick trend. It is a calculated response to the need for a new mission. The mission is no longer just providing for a household. It is creating something that reflects their individual values and ensures their long-term financial sovereignty. We must also look at the evolution of fatherhood in these new tribes. The 2026 American man is moving toward a model of sovereign fatherhood. This means he is no longer seeking permission or guidance from a maternal figure on how to parent. Through his tribe, he learns domestic skills, emotional regulation, and educational advocacy. Case studies show that children of sovereign fathers often develop high levels of adaptability and independence. They see their fathers as capable, multidimensional leaders of a household. This is a departure from the historical trope of the bumbling, incompetent divorced dad. The modern divorced man is often the most prepared, most organized parent in the room because he knows that his mistakes will be scrutinized by a legal system that he perceives as waiting for him to fail. However, as these tribes grow in influence, they are beginning to clash with traditional social institutions. Churches, civic clubs, and even political parties are struggling to integrate this new demographic of highly mobile, highly skeptical, and intensely loyal men. These men are less interested in broad social movements and more interested in the specific, tangible success of their immediate circle. They are creating their own private schools, their own investment pools, and their own localized economies. The cultural impact is a fragmentation of the traditional American community into smaller, more resilient, and more exclusive nodes. Robert's story doesn't end with him living in a co-living space. By late 2026, he has become a mentor himself, guiding younger men through the initial shock of the legal siege. He has built a life that is more robust, more social, and more physically healthy than the one he had during his marriage. But this transformation comes with a cost. The skepticism he developed toward the official narrative of the American dream has made him a ghost to traditional marketers and politicians. He doesn't respond to the same stimuli. He doesn't value the same status symbols. This brings us to a critical turning point in our deep dive. As men like Robert rebuild their lives and their tribes, they are also changing the way they interact with the opposite sex. The dating landscape of 2026 is being fundamentally rewritten by the second act man. These men are entering the dating market with a completely different set of priorities, a high degree of skepticism, and a new set of non-negotiable boundaries. But there is a dark side to this new realism. In their quest for protection and sovereignty, are men building walls that are too high to climb? Are we witnessing the permanent end of the romantic ideal in the American male consciousness? In the next part, we are going to look into the post-contract dating world, the rise of the vetting algorithms, and the controversial new rules of engagement that are defining modern American relationships. You need to see how the tribe influences the bedroom, and why the second act man might be the most difficult partner a woman will ever try to understand. The transition into the post-contract dating world in 2026 is characterized by a shift from emotional impulsivity to cold, calculated risk assessment. For the American man who has emerged from the legal and financial wreckage of a long-term marriage, the dating market is no longer a playground. It is a high-stakes environment where every potential partner is viewed through the lens of liability management. Imagine a man named Steven, a 52-year-old project manager in Seattle. Steven has spent the last 2 years stabilizing his life after a divorce that cost him 40% of his retirement savings and his primary residence. As he re-enters the dating scene in 2026, he is not looking for a soulmate in the traditional romanticized sense. He is looking for a low-friction, non-binding companionship that prioritizes his newly regained peace and financial sovereignty. Steven's approach represents a major historical trend: the death of the default marriage path. In previous decades, the trajectory of dating was predictable: meeting, exclusive dating, cohabitation, and marriage. By 2026, the second act man has deleted the final 2 steps of that sequence from his personal operating system. This is what sociologists are calling the permanent probationary period. Steven might date someone for 3 years without ever considering moving her into his home. The cultural impact of this is profound. It has created a massive demographic of men who are emotionally available for companionship, but legally and residentially fortressed. Case studies from urban centers across the U.S. show that men in this category are increasingly utilizing high-level vetting protocols before even the first date. Step 1 in this new world is the digital vetting algorithm. In 2026, men are utilizing specialized AI-driven tools to cross-reference a potential partner's public records, social media history, and even previous litigation involvement. This isn't out of malice, but out of a defensive necessity born from historical trends of high-conflict separations. Steven won't meet a woman for coffee until he knows if she has a history of litigious behavior, or if her digital footprint suggests a lifestyle that is fundamentally incompatible with his risk-averse financial planning. This has led to the rise of the social credit score within the dating world, an informal but powerful metric based on a person's stability and conflict history. The potential outcome is a dating market that is more transparent, but also significantly more clinical and less spontaneous. The second major shift is the normalization of the lifestyle agreement. Even for non-marital relationships, men like Steven are increasingly insisting on written understandings regarding financial boundaries. Imagine if Steven starts seeing a woman named Sarah. Before they take a vacation together, they have a clear documented agreement on how costs are split. If she spends the night at his place 3 times a week, there is a clear understanding that this does not constitute common law residency or an intent to merge households. In 2026, the American man is hyper-aware of the legal concept of palimony and de facto marriage. He is proactively protecting his second act assets through clear, verbal, and sometimes digital boundaries. This change in behavior is reshaping the dating experience from one of merging lives to one of parallel paths. Furthermore, we must look at the impact of the masculine tribe on these dating choices. As we discussed in the previous part, Steven is now part of an intentional community of men. This group acts as a decentralized vetting committee. In 2026, a man's peers have more influence over his romantic life than ever before. If Steven's tribe identifies red flags in a potential partner, specifically behaviors that resemble the patterns of his previous high-conflict marriage, they intervene with brutal honesty. This collective gatekeeping is a defense mechanism against the sunk cost fallacy that often leads men back into high-risk relationships. The historical trend shows that men who rely on their tribe for dating feedback are significantly less likely to enter a second high-conflict legal contract. There is also a fascinating biological component to this shift. Research in 2026 suggests that the second act man has a different neurochemical response to romance. The dopamine-driven infatuation phase, that dictates the behavior of younger men, is often dampened in the divorced man by a heightened cortisol response to perceived instability. Steven's brain is literally wired to prioritize safety over excitement. When a potential partner exhibits drama, Stephen's biological response is not an urge to fix or save the situation. It is a profound instinct to withdraw. This has led to a phenomenon where men are ending relationships at the first sign of emotional volatility. The cultural impact is a dating landscape where the margin for error is razor thin. Consider the case study of the solo resident boom. In 2026, single occupancy households among men aged 45 to 65 have reached an all-time high in the United States. This isn't just because these men are single, it's because they are choosing to remain solo even when in relationships. They value their autonomy, their control over their environment, and their ability to host their children in a space that is entirely theirs. The living apart together, or LAT model, is becoming the gold standard for the second act man. It allows for intimacy and companionship without the legal and domestic entanglement that led to their previous downfall. For many women entering the dating market in 2026, this is a difficult pill to swallow. They are meeting men who are kind, successful, and present, but who have a hard ceiling on how far the relationship can progress. This leads to the rise of the transactional clarity movement. Men are becoming much more upfront about what they can and cannot offer. In his dating profile, Stephen might explicitly state that he is not looking for marriage, children, or cohabitation. This level of candor is a direct response to the bait-and-switch dynamics that many men feel they experienced in their younger years. The potential outcome is a more honest dating environment, though it is one that many critics argue lacks the magic of traditional romance. However, for the man who has survived the family court grinder, clarity is far more valuable than magic. The impact on the marriage industry itself is catastrophic. In 2026, the wedding industry in the US is seeing a sharp decline in second-time ceremonies. Men are simply not interested in the performance of a wedding after having seen the machinery of a divorce. They are instead opting for commitment celebrations or partnership voyages that have no legal standing but serve the social purpose of acknowledging a significant bond. This is a fundamental decoupling of love from the state-sanctioned contract. But this new realism raises a haunting question about the future of the American family. If the most stable, financially secure men in society are opting out of the traditional family structure for their second act, what does that mean for the next generation? We are seeing the emergence of a split legacy culture. A man might have one set of children from a traditional marriage and then spend the rest of his life as a sovereign individual, leaving his remaining assets to his children or to his tribe rather than a second spouse. As we look deeper into this shift, we see that the second act man isn't just protecting his wallet, he is protecting his soul. He has learned that his value is not dependent on being a husband, but on his own self-mastery and his contributions to his community. But this journey toward total independence has a final, often overlooked stage: the legacy rebuild. Once a man has secured his peace, his health, and his finances, he begins to look at the long term. How does he ensure that his influence and his values survive him in a world where the traditional lines of inheritance and family are blurred? In the next part, we are going to look into the estate of the sovereign man. We will examine the complex new strategies men are using in 2026 to protect their wealth for their children, the rise of post-divorce philanthropy, and how the concept of the last will and testament is being used as a final act of domestic and social engineering. You need to understand how the divorced man is ensuring that his hard-earned victory outlasts his physical life, and why the inheritance wars of the future will look nothing like those of the past. The estate of the sovereign man in 2026 is no longer just a collection of assets. It is a fortress designed to withstand the shifting tides of American domestic law. To understand this final layer of protection, we must look at the case of Michael, a 58-year-old business owner in Nashville. After a decade of rebuilding from a high-conflict divorce that nearly bankrupted his construction firm, Michael has reached a level of financial stability that exceeds his pre-divorce years. However, his perspective on the future is radically different. In the past, Michael would have left his estate in a simple joint will with a spouse. Today, Michael represents a historical trend of asset atomization. He has spent the last 3 years working with specialized consultants to ensure that his legacy is insulated from future marital claims, both for himself and for his children. The first step in Michael's legacy protocol is the transition from individual ownership to the multi-generational private trust. In the United States, historical trends indicate that assets held directly by an individual are highly vulnerable during a divorce. By 2026, the sovereign man is increasingly placing his businesses, real estate, and intellectual property into irrevocable trusts where he is the manager but not the technical owner. This creates a potential outcome where his lifestyle is supported by the trust, but the core capital remains untouchable by future litigation or common law claims. For Michael, this means that even if he enters a long-term relationship that the state might later interpret as a domestic partnership, the construction company he spent 40 years building is legally partitioned. This is not about greed. It is about the preservation of a life's work against a legal system that he perceives as inherently volatile. Furthermore, we are seeing the rise of the divorce-proof inheritance. Michael is not just worried about his own future, he is terrified for his children. He has watched friends see their children's inheritance vanish in their own messy divorces. Consequently, the 2026 model of legacy includes bloodline trust provisions. These legal structures ensure that the money Michael leaves to his children can only be accessed by them, and cannot be considered a marital asset if they get divorced. The potential outcome of this trend is the creation of a new, insulated upper middle class in America, a demographic of heirs whose wealth is permanently shielded from the traditional marriage contract. This is a massive cultural shift in how wealth is perceived. It is no longer a shared resource for a new family, but a protected lineage asset. Imagine if Michael decided to use his estate as a tool for social engineering. In 2026, this is becoming a common practice among divorced men who feel disillusioned by traditional institutions. We are seeing a surge in directed philanthropy. Instead of leaving money to a university or a large national charity, Michael is setting up a private foundation dedicated to the very things that saved him during his restructuring: male mental health initiatives, father-centric legal reform, and vocational training for young men. The cultural impact is the emergence of a decentralized, privately funded social safety net for men, built by men who survived the system. This is the ultimate second-act victory, turning the pain of the past into a resource for the next generation. Now, let us analyze the mechanics of the digital estate. For the American man in 2026, his legacy isn't just in bricks and mortar. It is in his digital presence. Michael has spent years curating a private library of video lessons, personal philosophies, and family histories. This is the modern patriarch's archive. Through encrypted legacy contacts and decentralized storage, he ensures that his children and grandchildren have access to his unfiltered voice and experience, free from the narratives that may have been constructed during the conflict of his divorce. This step-by-step preservation of one's personal truth is a direct response to the narrative wars we discussed in earlier parts. Michael is ensuring that he, and not a court record, defines who he was. The potential outcomes of this sovereign estate planning are reshaping the American banking and legal industries. We are seeing the growth of boutique firms that specialize exclusively in post-divorce asset protection. These firms utilize historical trends to predict where the next legal vulnerabilities will emerge. For example, in 2026, there is significant focus on protecting the appreciation of premarital assets, a common battleground in U.S. divorce courts. Men like Michael are using periodic independent valuations and meticulous bookkeeping to create a paper trail of separation that makes it impossible for a future claimant to argue that the asset was commingled. This is the professionalization of personal life. Every major purchase, every investment, and every business expansion is executed with the divorce audit in mind. Consider the case study of the sovereign investment pool. In many U.S. cities, groups of divorced men are pooling their resources within these trust structures to invest in distressed real estate or new technology ventures. By investing through a shared entity rather than as individuals, they add another layer of anonymity and protection to their wealth. This is the financial wing of the tribe we explored earlier. It allows men to grow their wealth with the collective intelligence of their peers, while ensuring that no single individual's legal troubles can compromise the group's capital. This is a historical shift away from the family office model toward the fraternal office model. However, this level of insulation creates a new kind of social tension. Critics argue that the sovereign man's estate planning is undermining the social contract by preventing the equitable distribution of wealth. But for the man who has already seen his wealth redistributed once by a judge, these arguments carry little weight. The cultural impact is a growing divide in the American middle class between those who operate within the traditional marital legal system and those who have opted for a contractual autonomy model. Michael's children will grow up with a very different understanding of money and marriage than he did. They will see wealth as something that must be guarded with the same intensity with which it was earned. As Michael looks toward the end of his life, he feels a sense of quiet satisfaction. He has successfully navigated the most dangerous period of his existence, rebuilt his health, secured his tribe, and now he has locked his legacy behind a wall of sophisticated legal and financial architecture. He has moved from being a victim of a system to being a master of his own microsystem. But as the sovereign man secures his future, he must face one final unavoidable reality: the shifting political landscape of the United States. The rise of the sovereign man hasn't gone unnoticed by the state. In 2026, new legislative battles are brewing as the government looks for ways to tap into these protected pools of wealth and address the declining marriage rates that threaten the national tax base. The sovereign man is now in the crosshairs of the very system he tried to escape. In the next part, we are going to look into the political awakening of the divorced male. We will examine how this demographic is becoming a powerful, unpredictable voting bloc, the rise of fathers' rights political candidates, and the brewing conflict between the individual sovereignty movement and the state's desire for social stability. You need to see how the personal battle in the courtroom is becoming a national battle at the ballot box. The political awakening of the divorced male in 2026 is a seismic shift that has transformed a once fragmented and silent demographic into a disciplined, data-driven voting bloc. For decades, the divorced man in the United States was a political ghost, often too buried in the immediate survival of his legal and financial crisis to engage in civic activism. But historical trends have shifted. Imagine a man named Daniel, a 48-year-old high school principal in Phoenix. Daniel has navigated the system, rebuilt his life, and secured his personal tribe. Now, his focus has shifted from personal defense to systemic change. He is part of a growing movement of men who realize that the personal indignities they suffered in family court were not isolated incidents, but the result of specific legislative policies. Daniel and millions like him are now engaging in what is known as the precinct strategy for family reform. This involves a step-by-step infiltration of local political structures to influence the appointment of judges and the drafting of state-level domestic codes. In 2026, the potential outcomes of this movement are already manifesting in state houses across the country. This demographic is no longer voting along traditional Republican or Democratic lines. Instead, they are single-issue voters focused on three core pillars: rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting, the elimination of lifetime alimony, and the reform of Title IV financial incentives. Daniel's vote is no longer up for grabs based on general economic promises. It is earned by the candidate who pledges to modernize the domestic relations code. Case studies from the 2024 and 2025 election cycles show that in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, the divorced dad vote has become a decisive factor. Candidates are being forced to address the specific grievances of this group in their stump speeches. We are seeing the rise of the divorce reform platform, a set of policy proposals that prioritize the rights of the individual against what many men perceive as a predatory legal industry. This is a massive cultural impact because it moves the conversation of divorce from the therapist's office to the legislative floor. Men are framing their struggle as a civil rights issue, citing historical trends of gender-based disparities in custody awards and financial obligations. Imagine if a political candidate in 2026 ran a campaign specifically targeting the millions of men who feel the state has overreached into their domestic lives. This is happening now. These candidates are utilizing the digital communities and tribes we explored earlier to bypass traditional media and speak directly to their base. They use data to show the correlation between father absence, often caused by restrictive custody arrangements, and broader social issues like crime and educational failure. By doing so, they are shifting the narrative from male grievance to community stability. This strategy is effectively neutralizing the traditional deadbeat dad trope that has long been used to dismiss male political concerns. The state's reaction to this awakening is a study in tension. On one hand, policymakers recognize the legitimate grievances and the voting power of this demographic. On the other hand, the state has a vested interest in social stability, which historically has been tied to the preservation of the traditional family unit and the reliable flow of support payments that reduce the burden on public welfare systems. In 2026, we are witnessing a clash between the state's revenue model and the sovereign man's autonomy. Legislative battles are currently raging over the transparency of how child support funds are handled and the methods used by state enforcement agencies. The potential outcome is a fundamental restructuring of the American social contract, where the state is forced to treat fathers as equal partners rather than secondary financial resources. Let us analyze the step-by-step mobilization of this group. It starts with local judicial vetting. In 2026, Organizations led by men like Daniel are creating comprehensive databases of family court judges. They track every ruling, every custody percentage, and every alimony award. This data is then used to create judicial scorecards that are distributed to voters. If a judge has a historical trend of granting less than 40% custody to fit fathers, they face a coordinated campaign to be unseated. This is a level of political accountability that the family court system has never encountered. It is turning local judicial elections, which were once sleepy affairs, into high-stakes political battlegrounds. Furthermore, we are seeing the emergence of the Divorce Industry Transparency Act in several states. This legislation, pushed by the new male voting bloc, seeks to cap legal fees in domestic cases and mandate mediation before litigation can even begin. The cultural impact here is the direct assault on the profitability of divorce. By making the process less lucrative for the legal profession, these men hope to reduce the adversarial nature of separation. This is a tactical strike at the heart of the divorce economy. Case studies from states that have implemented similar reforms show a significant drop in high-conflict litigation and an increase in collaborative parenting agreements. This political awakening also extends to the workplace. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of male domestic advocacy in the corporate sphere. Men are demanding that their employers offer the same level of flexibility and support for divorced parenting as they do for traditional family structures. This includes things like custody week remote work options and legal insurance that covers domestic litigation. Daniel's school district, for example, recently updated its HR policy to include a family transition benefit that provides counseling and legal resources for staff going through a split. This is a recognition that a man's domestic stability is directly tied to his professional productivity. However, as this movement gains steam, it faces significant pushback from established interest groups. Bar associations and certain advocacy groups argue that these reforms threaten the best interests of the child standard. The conflict in 2026 is centered on who gets to define those best interests. The new male political bloc argues that the best interest of a child is naturally served by the maximum involvement of both parents, whereas the opposition argues for judicial discretion. This is not just a legal debate, it is a battle over the definition of the American family. Consider the potential outcome of this trend over the next decade. If the sovereign man successfully retools the legal and political landscape, we could see a return to higher rates of paternal involvement, but within a much more fragmented and contractual society. The family may no longer be a state-facilitated institution, but a private, negotiated agreement. This would lead to a more resilient, but perhaps less cohesive social fabric. For Daniel, this is the goal. A world where his role as a father is protected by law, not subject to the whims of a single individual or a biased court. As we look at the political horizon of 2026, the sovereign man is no longer on the defensive. He is a strategist, a campaigner, and a kingmaker. He has learned that the only way to protect his personal peace is to change the rules of the game for everyone. But as the rules change and as men gain more legal and social ground, a new and unexpected challenge is emerging. In a world where the risks of marriage are mitigated and the rights of fathers are secured, will men return to the institution of marriage? Or has the cultural impact of the last 20 years created a permanent shift in how men view long-term commitment? In the next part, we are going to look into the post-reform marriage market. We will examine the rise of the smart marriage contract, the decline of the standard license, and how the next generation of American men is approaching commitment with a level of precision that makes traditional vows look like a relic of the past. You need to see how the victory at the ballot box is changing the bedroom once again, and why the traditional wedding might be on the verge of extinction. The move toward a post-reform marriage market in the United States is not a retreat from companionship, but a total reimagining of the legal and social terms upon which it is built. In 2026, the traditional wedding, once a rite of passage, is increasingly viewed by the American man as a high-exposure liability event. To understand this shift, let us look at Christopher, a 39-year-old data scientist in Chicago. Christopher has watched the previous generation, men like Daniel and James, undergo the restructuring we have meticulously detailed. He has seen the biological cost, the digital narrative wars, and the legal sieges. As he prepares to commit to a long-term partner, Christopher is not heading to the county clerk for a standard marriage license. Instead, he represents a growing historical trend of the bespoke domestic agreement. Christopher is part of a demographic that is pioneering the smart marriage contract. In 2026, the potential outcomes of a standard, state-sanctioned marriage license are seen as too broad and too unpredictable. Christopher and his partner have instead opted for a private, legally binding contract that outlines the specific financial and domestic expectations of their union before any ceremony takes place. This is a step-by-step deconstruction of the traditional for better or worse vow, replacing it with under these specific conditions. They have defined exactly how premarital assets will be shielded, how future income will be allocated, and even how potential childcare responsibilities would be split in the event of a future separation. This is the professionalization of romance. It is a move toward total transparency, where the emotional bond is supported by a clear, algorithmic framework of protection. The cultural impact of this shift is the death of the default wedding. In the US today, we are seeing a massive decline in the traditional multi-billion-dollar wedding industry. Men are no longer willing to finance a one-day performance that historically precedes a 50% chance of a multi-year legal battle. Instead, we see the rise of commitment summits. These are private gatherings where a couple celebrates their partnership with friends and family, but without the involvement of the state. Christopher's ceremony in 2026 was a weekend retreat focused on shared values and community building. There was no signing of a government document. This is a historical trend of decoupling, separating the spiritual and social bond from the legal and financial entity. Now, imagine if Christopher's approach became the standard for all of Gen Z and the Alpha generation. We would see a fundamental shift in the American tax and welfare systems. For decades, the U.S. government has used the marriage license as a tool for social engineering and revenue tracking. As men like Christopher opt out of the standard license, the state is losing its primary mechanism for domestic regulation. This is why we are seeing new case studies of contractual cohabitation, laws being debated in states like Texas and Florida. The government is attempting to catch up to the sovereign man by creating new legal categories that mimic marriage without the traditional label. However, the 2026 man is staying one step ahead by utilizing private trusts and decentralized agreements to keep his domestic life strictly private. This leads us to the rise of the relationship audit. In Christopher's circle, it is common practice for couples to have an annual strategic review of their partnership. They look at their financial goals, their domestic labor balance, and their individual growth. This is a direct byproduct of the lessons learned from the restructuring generation. By treating the relationship with the same level of scrutiny as a business partnership, these men believe they can identify and mitigate conflict before it reaches a terminal stage. The potential outcome is a much more stable, albeit less romantic in the classical sense, form of partnership. Case studies of couples using this model show a significantly lower rate of high-conflict separation, because the terms of the relationship are constantly being renegotiated and clarified. Furthermore, we must analyze the evolution of prenuptial education. In 2026, the American man is no longer entering commitments blindly. There is a surge in men attending intensive workshops that combine legal literacy with psychological resilience training. These programs teach men how to vet partners not just for compatibility, but for legal temperament. Christopher spent 6 months in a foundational partnership program before he even proposed the idea of a long-term commitment. This education focuses on historical trends of domestic litigation and teaches men how to spot the early warning signs of high-conflict personality traits. The cultural impact is a new kind of emotional intelligence that is rooted in self-preservation and risk management. Consider the impact on the real estate and insurance markets. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of dual-asset housing. These are homes designed with the expectation of two separate, protected financial lives. Think of a house with 2 primary suites and clearly defined private office spaces, allowing each partner to maintain their individual sovereignty, even while living together. Insurance companies are now offering relationship continuity insurance, which provides a financial buffer and legal mediation services if a non-marital partnership dissolves. This is the market adapting to the sovereign man's refusal to engage with the traditional system. Christopher's home was purchased through a complex LLC structure that ensures both he and his partner have clear, protected equity that is not subject to the whims of a family court judge. There is also a fascinating shift in the concept of family heritage. In Christopher's world, the family name and the family legacy are no longer tied to a single marriage certificate. We are seeing a move toward lineage preservation through private family constitutions. These documents outline the values, the history, and the long-term goals of the family, and they are passed down regardless of marital status. Christopher is more focused on ensuring his children understand the code of the tribe than he is on the status of his own relationship. This is a return to a more ancient, clan-based understanding of family that predates the modern American nuclear model. But as this new realism takes hold, we must ask, what is the cost of this total optimization? As Christopher and his peers build these fortresses of protection and clarity, are they losing the ability to truly merge with another human being? The historical trend shows that while these partnerships are more stable and less legally risky, they also tend to be more transactional. The potential outcome is a society of efficient partners who are highly productive and low conflict, but who may experience a different kind of loneliness, one born from never truly letting their guard down. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most important part of our deep dive. We have looked at the collapse, the restructuring, the biological cost, the political awakening, and the new rules of engagement. We have seen how the American man in 2026 has become a sovereign architect of his own life. But what is the ultimate destination of this journey? In the final part of this series, we are going to look into the future of the American male spirit. We will examine the emerging philosophy of the new masculinity, how men are finding meaning in a world that has been stripped of traditional domestic certainties, and what the final legacy of the divorce era will be for the United States. You need to see the final picture of the man who has survived it all, and why his newfound strength might be the very thing that saves, or forever changes, the American experiment. We are going to reveal the endgame of the sovereign man. The endgame of the sovereign man in 2026 is not a destination of isolation, but a state of hyperconscious integration. We have traced the journey of the American man from the initial shock of the legal filing through the biological reconstruction, the digital wars, and the political awakening. Now we arrive at the final evolution, the emergence of the Stoic architect. To understand this culmination, look at Thomas, a 63-year-old retired aerospace engineer in San Diego. Thomas represents the final historical trend in our deep dive. He is a man who has successfully navigated 2 divorces across 4 decades, and has emerged not as a victim of the system, but as its most sophisticated critic and beneficiary. Thomas has achieved what many in the US now strive for: a life where his peace is entirely decoupled from the volatility of external institutions. The first pillar of the sovereign man's endgame is the mastery of internal validation. Historically, the American male identity was an externalized construct, built on the shifting sands of corporate titles and marital status. By 2026, the potential outcomes of this traditional model have been exposed as inherently unstable. Thomas has transitioned to a step-by-step internal audit system. He no longer looks to a spouse or a social circle to define his worth. His daily routine is a clinical exercise in self-maintenance and intellectual expansion. This is the cultural impact of the divorce era. It has forced a generation of men to develop a psychological resilience that was previously rare. In 2026, we see a surge in men engaging in deep work practices, solo travel, and advanced skill acquisition, not for the purpose of dating or career advancement, but for the intrinsic value of self-mastery. Imagine if a significant portion of the US male population stopped seeking approval from traditional social structures. The result is a massive shift in consumer behavior. Thomas is invisible to traditional marketing. He does not buy the status symbol car to impress a neighbor, or the luxury watch to signify professional success. His spending is directed toward utility, health, longevity, and legacy assets. This is the economic sovereignty phase. Case studies of men in this endgame show a dramatic reduction in lifestyle creep. They live in high-efficiency, high-technology environments that prioritize their time and their biological health. This shift is creating a deflationary pressure on the luxury goods market, while fueling a boom in the specialized longevity and educational sectors. The second pillar is the creation of the mentorship legacy. In 2026, the sovereign man understands that his final victory is the transmission of his hard-earned wisdom to the next generation. Thomas spends his weekends not in a golf club, but in a private workshop he built for younger men in his tribe. This is the step-by-step handoff of the new code of conduct. He teaches them about the historical trends of family law, the biological mechanics of stress management, and the importance of digital privacy. This is a decentralized, grassroots education system that is operating outside of the traditional American university or church. The cultural impact is the formation of a shadow intellectual class, men who are highly skilled, legally literate, and deeply skeptical of the state's domestic narratives. This is the endgame, ensuring that the suffering of the previous generation becomes the protective armor of the next. Let us analyze the potential outcome of this intergenerational transfer. We are seeing the rise of the neo-patriarch. Unlike the patriarchs of the 1950s, who relied on state-enforced marriage and corporate loyalty, the 2026 version is a creature of contract and community. Thomas's children and grandchildren do not view him as a figurehead of a nuclear family, but as the navigator of a complex global system. He provides them with the legal frameworks and the financial trusts we discussed in earlier parts, ensuring their autonomy. This is the transition from family as a unit to family as a network. The sovereign man's endgame is the creation of a resilient, multi-generational web of individuals who share a common philosophy of risk mitigation and personal excellence. Furthermore, we must look at the spiritual recalibration of the 2026 man. Historically, the U.S. divorce rate led to a spike in nihilism among men. However, the sovereign man has replaced nihilism with a form of active realism. Thomas does not pine for a lost golden age of the American family. He accepts the world as a place of high-stakes legal and social competition, and finds meaning in his ability to thrive within it. This is the birth of the post-romantic spirit. Men are finding a sense of the sacred not in the happily ever after myth, but in the precision of a well-executed life. This spiritual shift is manifesting in a new wave of American literature and philosophy that emphasizes duty to the self and the tribe over duty to the abstract state or the romantic ideal. Consider the case study of the sovereign man's health span. By 2026, the data indicates that men like Thomas, who have successfully restructured their lives, are outliving their married peers in certain high-stress demographics. This is because they have eliminated the chronic stress of high-conflict domesticity and replaced it with a strictly managed, low-cortisol lifestyle. The sovereign man's endgame includes a radical commitment to biological optimization. Thomas uses advanced diagnostics to monitor his systemic inflammation and cognitive function with the same precision he once used to monitor aerospace components. This is the ultimate ROI of his divorce. He has traded a high-conflict social contract for a decade of additional, high-quality life. However, the final stage of the endgame involves a complex relationship with the concept of community. The sovereign man is not a hermit. Thomas is deeply involved in his local community, but on his own terms. He serves on boards, he advises startups, and he participates in local governance. But he does so with a contractual mindset. He does not give his time or his resources out of a sense of vague social obligation. He does so where he can exert maximum influence and see tangible results. This is the professionalization of civic duty. It is making local American communities more efficient, but also more transactional. As we conclude this deep dive into the cultural impact of divorce on men in the USA, we see a landscape that has been forever altered. The year 2026 marks the point where the divorced dad stopped being a punchline and started being the blueprint for a new kind of American citizen. The sovereign man is a product of the system's failures, but he is no longer defined by them. He is the man who looked into the abyss of the family court, the digital narrative wars, and the biological collapse, and decided to build a fortress instead of a grave. The American experiment is being saved by this newfound strength because these men are bringing a level of discipline, legal literacy, and emotional regulation back into the public square. They are the new architects of a society that is moving away from fragile, state-dependent institutions toward robust, decentralized networks. The endgame of the sovereign man is not the destruction of the family, but its ultimate upgrade into a form that can survive the 21st century. While this concludes our 10-part masterclass on the current state of the American male, the story is far from over. The shifts we have documented are currently triggering a massive counter-reaction in the American legislative and social spheres. A new conflict is brewing between the rise of the sovereign man and the institutions that seek to redomesticate him. We have seen how the man changed. Now you need to see how the world tries to change him back. In our next series, we will look into the state's counterstrike, the upcoming battles over universal domestic responsibility, laws, and the high-tech surveillance systems being designed to track the sovereign man's assets. The game is just beginning.